Hello everyone, welcome to the channel that brings you the best and most authentic accounts of attacks and sightings of the legendary Bigfoot. Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. Click the like button, all because.
The mist clung to the Santa Cruz Mountains like a shroud, obscuring the dense canopy of redwoods and Douglas firs that loomed overhead. Chris Davis adjusted the straps of his backpack, his excitement for the weekend hike mingling with an inexplicable sense of unease. Beside him, his girlfriend Rachel beamed, her blue eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Ready for an adventure, babe?" Rachel asked, playfully nudging Chris with her elbow. Chris forced a smile, pushing down the nagging feeling in his gut. "Born ready. Let's conquer this trail." They set off down the path, their boots crunching on a carpet of dried leaves and pine needles. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. As they walked, Chris couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. "Hey, Rach," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Does something feel off to you?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Off? Like what?" "I don't know. Just a weird vibe, I guess." She laughed, the sound echoing through the trees. "Come on, Chris. Don't tell me you're scared of the big bad forest." Chris chuckled weakly, but her laughter seemed to hang in the air unnaturally long, as if the woods themselves were mocking him. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. As they continued their ascent, the trail narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Chris took the lead, pushing aside low-hanging branches and navigating around moss-covered boulders. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of them. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. Chris froze, his heart pounding. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her earlier bravado evaporating. "Probably just a branch falling," Chris replied, not entirely convinced. He scanned the misty woods, searching for the source of the noise. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and writhe, playing tricks on his eyes. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice tight. "I don't like standing still in this fog." They pressed on, the weight of their backpacks growing heavier with each step. The trail steepened, and soon they were scrambling over rocky outcroppings, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hold up," Rachel called, leaning against a tree trunk. "I need a water break." Chris nodded, grateful for the chance to catch his breath. He unslung his pack and retrieved their water bottles, handing one to Rachel. As she took a long drink, Chris surveyed their surroundings. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing glimpses of the valley below. But something about the view seemed wrong, distorted somehow. "Chris," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you smell that?" He inhaled deeply, immediately wishing he hadn't. A pungent, musky odor filled his nostrils, reminiscent of wet dog and rotting meat. "Yeah," he gagged. "What the hell is that?" Rachel wrinkled her nose. "Maybe there's a dead animal nearby?" "Maybe," Chris muttered, unconvinced. The smell was too strong, too alien to be a simple carcass. It seemed to be everywhere, and nowhere at once, as if the forest itself was exuding the foul stench. A low, rumbling growl drifted through the trees, so deep it was almost subsonic. Chris felt it in his chest more than heard it with his ears. Rachel clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "Tell me that was your stomach," she whispered. Chris shook his head slowly, his eyes darting from tree to tree. "We should get moving now." They hastily repacked their bags and set off at a brisk pace, no longer stopping to admire the scenery or catch their breath. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by their labored breathing and the occasional snapping twig beneath their feet. As dusk approached, the shadows lengthened, taking on a life of their own. More than once, Chris could have sworn he saw a massive, hulking shape flitting between the trees, always just at the edge of his vision. "Chris," Rachel hissed, tugging on his sleeve. "Look!" He followed her pointing finger to a nearby tree. Deep gouges marred the trunk, as if something with enormous claws had used it as a scratching post. The marks were fresh, sap still oozing from the wounded bark. That's not normal, Chris stammered. Mountain lions don't do that, do they? Rachel shook her head, her face pale. It's too high up, and those marks are huge. A twig snapped behind them, and they both whirled around. The fog swirled in the fading light, creating phantasmal shapes that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. We need to find a place to camp, Chris said, fighting to keep his voice steady. It's getting too dark to keep going. Rachel nodded, her earlier excitement replaced by grim determination. They moved off the main trail, searching for a suitable clearing. After what felt like an eternity, they found a small open area nestled between two large boulders. As they set up their tent with shaking hands, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake. The forest had gone eerily quiet, not even the chirping of insects breaking the silence. Should we start a fire? Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris hesitated. On one hand, the fire would provide warmth and light. On the other, it might attract unwanted attention. Yeah, he decided finally. But let's keep it small. They gathered kindling and larger branches, working quickly in the fading light. As Chris struck a match, the flame seemed to sputter and dim, as if the very air was fighting against it. Finally, a small fire sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Rachel huddled close to Chris, seeking comfort in his presence. "Tell me I'm being silly," she murmured. "Tell me there's nothing out there." Chris opened his mouth to reassure her, but the words died in his throat. Because at that moment he saw it, a pair of gleaming eyes reflecting the firelight, watching them from the darkness beyond their camp. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they radiated an intelligence that sent chills down Chris's spine. "Rach," he breathed, "don't move." But as quickly as they had appeared, the eyes vanished, leaving Chris to wonder if he had imagined them. The fire flickered wildly, casting monstrous shapes on the surrounding foliage. Each shadow seemed to conceal some lurking horror, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "What is it?" Rachel asked, her voice quavering. "What did you see?" Chris swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I'm not sure," he lied, unwilling to voice his suspicions. "Probably just an animal curious about our fire." Rachel nodded, but her grip on his arm tightened. They sat in tense silence, jumping at every rustle of leaves and creak of branches. The night wore on, and exhaustion began to overtake their fear. "We should try to get some sleep," Chris suggested, though the thought of closing his eyes filled him with dread. "I'll take first watch." Rachel nodded gratefully and crawled into the tent. Chris positioned himself by the fire, his back to the boulder, scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. The night wore on, and despite his best efforts, Chris felt his eyelids growing heavy. Just as he was about to wake Rachel for her shift, a blood-curdling howl pierced the night. It was unlike anything Chris had ever heard, part roar, part scream, and entirely terrifying. Rachel bolted upright in the tent, her eyes wide with fear. "Chris," she cried, "what was that?" Before he could answer, the howl came again, closer this time, too close. Chris scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. "Get out of the tent," he hissed urgently. "We need to go. Now." As Rachel emerged, pale and shaking, a massive shape detached itself from the shadows. It was vaguely humanoid but far too large, its body covered in thick, matted fur. The firelight gleamed off its eyes, the same eyes Chris had seen earlier, filled with predatory intelligence. In that moment, Chris knew with sickening certainty that their hike had become something far more terrifying. The stuff of campfire stories and grainy photographs stood before them, all too real and all too deadly. The beast raised its head and roared, the sound shaking the very ground beneath their feet. And as the first chapter of their nightmare began, Chris realized that the horror was only just beginning. The campfire sputtered and hissed, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Chris stared into the flames, his mind replaying the terrifying encounter from earlier. Beside him, Rachel huddled close, her eyes darting nervously between the flickering light and the impenetrable darkness beyond. "Do you think it's still out there?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Chris swallowed hard, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "I don't know, Rach, but we can't let our guard down." As if in response to his words, the fire suddenly flared, casting elongated shadows across the clearing. The surrounding foliage seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in grotesque patterns. Chris could have sworn he saw hulking shapes moving just beyond the firelight's reach. "Did you see that?" he hissed, grabbing Rachel's arm. She nodded, her face pale in the firelight. "What are we going to do, Chris? We can't stay here all night." Before Chris could respond, a blood-curdling howl pierced the night air. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, a primal scream that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Rachel let out a strangled gasp, her fingers digging into Chris's arm. "Oh God, oh God," she whimpered. "It's coming back." The howl came again, closer this time. Chris scrambled to his feet, pulling Rachel up with him. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Grab only what we need. We're getting out of here." They hastily stuffed their backpacks with essential supplies, hands shaking as they worked. The forest around them had gone eerily silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Just as they were about to leave the clearing, Chris froze. There, illuminated by the dying embers of their fire, was a set of footprints in the soft mud. But these were no ordinary tracks. Each print was massive, easily twice the size of his own foot, with clear impressions of long, curved claws at the tips. "Rachel," he breathed. "Look at this." She crouched down beside him, her eyes widening in horror as she took in the sight. That's impossible," she stammered. "Nothing human could make prints like that." "I don't think we're dealing with anything human," Chris replied grimly. A twig snapped in the darkness, and they both whirled around. The shadows seemed to shift and coalesce, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as he strained his eyes, trying to make out details in the gloom. "Run," he whispered to Rachel. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1, go." They took off into the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. Behind them, they could hear the sound of something large giving chase, branches snapping like twigs under its weight. Chris and Rachel ran blindly through the night, their lungs burning and legs aching. The dense canopy overhead blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving them to stumble through near-total darkness. Several times, Chris felt branches whip across his face, leaving stinging welts. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they burst into a small clearing. Gasping for breath, they paused to get their bearings. I think we lost it," Rachel panted, doubling over with her hands on her knees. Chris nodded, too winded to speak. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he scanned their surroundings. The clearing was unremarkable, just another patch of forest floor covered in fallen leaves, and his breath caught in his throat. "Rachel," he said slowly, "don't move." But it was too late. Rachel had already seen what had caught Chris's attention. There, partially hidden by a fallen log, was the mangled carcass of a deer. Its belly had been torn open, entrails spilled across the forest floor. Huge chunks of flesh had been ripped from its flanks, and its head was twisted at an unnatural angle. Rachel's face turned ashen, and she clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. "Oh my God," she choked out. "What could do something like that?" Chris shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the grisly scene. "I don't know, but I don't want to stick around to find out. We need to keep moving." They skirted the edge of the clearing, giving the deer carcass a wide berth. As they reached the far side, Chris noticed something that made his blood run cold. Leading away from the dead deer was a trail of massive footprints, the same prints they had seen back at their campsite. "It's been through here," he murmured. "And recently." Rachel gripped his arm tightly. Which way do we go? We can't follow its tracks. Chris closed his eyes, trying to remember the map of the area. There should be a ranger station about 5 miles east of here. If we can make it there, we'll be safe. They set off again, moving as quickly and quietly as they could through the dense undergrowth. The forest seemed to press in around them, every shadow concealing potential danger. More than once, Chris thought he heard heavy breathing or the snap of a branch behind them, but each time he looked back, there was nothing there. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Chris and Rachel stumbled upon another small clearing. Exhausted and on edge, they decided to risk a short rest. "We should be getting close to the ranger station," Chris said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Just a little further and we'll be okay." Rachel nodded wearily, slumping against a tree trunk. "I hope you're right. I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Chris was about to respond when a foul odor assaulted his nostrils. It was the same musky, rotting smell they had encountered earlier, but much stronger now. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Rachel nodded, wrinkling her nose in disgust. "It's that same awful stench from before, but where's it coming from?" They both scanned the clearing, and that's when Chris saw it. Their food cache, which they had carefully hung from a high branch to keep away from bears, had been completely destroyed. Shredded remains of energy bars and trail mix littered the ground, and deep claw marks scored the trunk of the tree. "It found our food," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But how? We were miles away from here." Rachel's eyes widened in horror. "Chris," she breathed, "what if it's been hurting us? What if it's been driving us exactly where it wants us to go?" The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. If she was right, then they had been playing into the creature's hands, or paws, this entire time. The ranger station they had been heading towards might not be the sanctuary they hoped for, but a trap. A low, rumbling growl emanated from the trees behind them, causing both Chris and Rachel to freeze in terror. Slowly, they turned to face the source of the sound. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood a massive, hair-covered figure. It was easily 8 feet tall, with powerful limbs and a barrel chest. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a sloping forehead and a protruding jaw filled with sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that truly chilled Chris to his core, intelligent, predatory, and filled with an almost human malevolence. "Run," Chris whispered to Rachel, not daring to take his eyes off the creature. "Run now, and don't look back." As they turned to flee, the Bigfoot let out an ear-splitting roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. The chase was on once more, but this time, Chris knew with sickening certainty that they were no longer the hunters trying to find their way out of the forest. They were the prey, and the true horror of their situation was only beginning to unfold. The forest had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by Chris and Rachel's ragged breathing as they stumbled through the underbrush. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. "We need to find somewhere to rest," Rachel gasped, her face pale with exhaustion. "We can't keep running forever." Chris nodded grimly, scanning their surroundings. "There's a small clearing up ahead. We can catch our breath there and try to figure out our next move." They pushed through a dense thicket of ferns, emerging into a small open area surrounded by towering redwoods. Chris helped Rachel lower herself onto a fallen log, then slumped down beside her. "Do you think we lost it?" Rachel whispered, her eyes darting nervously between the trees. Before Chris could answer, a low rumble echoed through the clearing. At first, he thought it was thunder, but then he realized the sound was coming from the ground itself. "What the?" he began, but his words were cut short as a massive boulder came crashing through their makeshift campsite, missing them by mere inches. Rachel screamed, scrambling backwards off the log. Chris leapt to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her towards the tree line. But it was too late. The bushes at the edge of the clearing parted, revealing a sight that would haunt Chris's nightmares for years to come. A towering, hair-covered beast stepped into view, its massive frame blocking out the early morning light. Glowing eyes fixed on the terrified couple, filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Oh God," Rachel whimpered, her voice barely audible. "It's real. It's really real." The creature let out a bone-chilling roar that shook the very air around them. Chris felt his legs go weak, every instinct screaming at him to flee. But he knew they couldn't outrun this monster. Their only hope was to somehow fight it off. "Rachel," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "when I say go, I want you to run as fast as you can towards the ranger station. Don't look back no matter what you hear, do you understand?" Rachel nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Chris lied, knowing full well that one of them needed to distract the creature if the other had any hope of escaping. The Bigfoot took a lumbering step forward, its massive feet leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. Chris tensed, ready to spring into action. "Now, Rachel, go!" he shouted, lunging forward and scooping up a broken branch from the ground. Rachel took off running, crashing through the underbrush. The creature's head swiveled to follow her movement, but Chris waved the branch wildly, trying to keep its attention. "Hey, you overgrown ape!" he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Over here!" The Bigfoot's eyes locked onto Chris, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something almost like amusement in its gaze. Then it charged. Chris swung the branch with all his might, connecting solidly with the creature's midsection. But it was like hitting a brick wall. The branch shattered, and Chris found himself face to face with the monster. A massive hand shot out, faster than Chris would have thought possible for something so large. He tried to dodge, but the Bigfoot's fingers closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Chris clawed at the hairy arm, gasping for air. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision as the creature brought its face close to his. The stench of rotting meat washed over him, making him gag. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. "Chris, no!" Rachel had returned, armed with a large rock. She hurled it at the Bigfoot's head, connecting with a solid thunk. The creature roared in pain and anger, dropping Chris to the ground. Chris hit the forest floor hard, coughing and wheezing as he struggled to draw breath. Through watering eyes, he saw the Bigfoot turn its attention to Rachel. "Run!" he tried to shout, but it came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. Rachel turned to flee, but she wasn't fast enough. The Bigfoot closed the distance in 2 massive strides, its hand clamping over her mouth mid-scream. She thrashed wildly in its grip, her muffled cries of terror barely audible. Desperation gave Chris strength. He pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain that lanced through his bruised body. With a primal yell, he charged at the creature, intending to tackle it and free Rachel. But the Bigfoot saw him coming. Without releasing its hold on Rachel, it swung its free arm in a backhanded blow that caught Chris square in the chest. The force of the impact sent him flying through the air like a rag doll. Chris's world spun as he sailed through the clearing. His flight came to an abrupt end as he slammed into the trunk of a massive redwood. He felt something pop in his shoulder, a white-hot burst of agony that momentarily overwhelmed even his terror. He slumped to the ground, dazed and in excruciating pain. Through blurry vision, he saw the Bigfoot lumbering away, still clutching a struggling Rachel in its grasp. "No," Chris moaned, trying to push himself up. But his left arm wouldn't respond, hanging limply at his side. His shoulder was definitely dislocated, possibly worse. "Rachel," he called out, his voice weak and strained. "Rachel." But there was no response. The forest had fallen silent once more, save for the rustle of leaves in the gentle morning breeze. It was as if the terrifying encounter had never happened. Chris slumped back against the tree, fighting against the waves of pain and nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't pass out. Not now. Rachel needed him. With gritted teeth, he used his good arm to push himself to his feet. The world tilted alarmingly, and he had to lean against the tree to keep from falling. "Okay, Chris," he muttered to himself. You can do this. One step at a time. He stumbled forward, following the trail of destruction left by the Bigfoot. Broken branches and deep footprints marked its path through the underbrush. As he walked, Chris tried to make sense of what had just happened. The creature they had encountered was like something out of a nightmare. Its strength, its speed, its intelligence, it defied everything he thought he knew about the natural world. And now it had Rachel. The thought sent a chill down Chris's spine. What did it want with her? Where was it taking her? He pushed aside a low-hanging branch, wincing as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. The trail led to another small clearing, and Chris's heart sank as he saw what lay within. The ground was torn up, as if a great struggle had taken place. Scraps of fabric, Rachel's shirt, he realized with a jolt, were scattered about. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a single shoe, Rachel's hiking boot. Chris fell to his knees, picking up the boot with trembling hands. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." But he couldn't give up. Not yet. Rachel was still out there, in the clutches of that monster. And Chris was the only one who could save her. With renewed determination, he pushed himself back to his feet. The pain in his shoulder had faded to a dull throb, adrenaline and fear pushing it to the background of his awareness. "I'm coming, Rachel," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Whatever it takes, I'm going to find you." The world spun around Chris as he struggled to his feet, his dislocated shoulder sending waves of agony through his body. Through blurry vision, he saw the Bigfoot's massive form retreating into the forest, Rachel's limp body slung over its shoulder like a rag doll. "Rachel," he croaked, his voice raw and barely audible. "No." Adrenaline surged through his veins, momentarily dulling the pain. Chris stumbled forward, his good arm outstretched, as if he could somehow reach Rachel from across the clearing. But the creature was already disappearing into the dense underbrush, taking with it the person he loved most in the world. "I'm coming, Rachel," Chris muttered through gritted teeth. "I won't let it take you." He scanned the ground frantically, knowing he needed a weapon, anything to give him a fighting chance against the monster. His eyes landed on a heavy branch, about as thick as his arm and nearly as long. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Chris's fingers closed around the makeshift weapon, ignoring the splinters that dug into his palm. With a grunt of effort, he hefted the branch and set off in pursuit of the Bigfoot. The forest seemed to close in around him as he crashed through the undergrowth. Branches whipped at his face, leaving stinging welts, but Chris barely noticed. His entire being was focused on one goal: saving Rachel. "Hold on, Rachel," he panted as he ran. "I'm coming, just hold on." The trail left by the Bigfoot was easy to follow. Broken branches and deep, inhuman footprints marked its passage. Chris pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the throbbing pain in his shoulder. Suddenly, a blood-curdling roar shook the forest, causing birds to take flight in panic. Chris skidded to a stop, his heart pounding. The sound had come from just ahead. Cautiously, he crept forward, using the dense foliage as cover. He emerged at the edge of a small ravine, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The Bigfoot stood at the bottom of the ravine, its massive back turned to Chris. Rachel lay motionless on the ground at its feet. From his vantage point, Chris couldn't tell if she was breathing. "No," he whispered, fear and rage warring within him. "You bastard!" Without thinking, Chris charged down the steep slope, his makeshift club raised high. The loose soil and rocks shifted under his feet, sending him stumbling and sliding, but he managed to keep his footing. The Bigfoot must have heard his approach because it began to turn, but Chris was faster. With all his strength, he swung the branch, connecting solidly with the creature's broad back. The impact sent shockwaves up Chris's arm, nearly causing him to drop the branch. The Bigfoot roared in pain and anger, the sound so loud in the confines of the ravine that Chris felt it in his bones. For a moment, hope surged through him. He had heard it. The creature wasn't invincible, but his triumph was short-lived. The Bigfoot spun with impossible speed, its glowing eyes fixed on Chris with murderous intent. Before he could react, a massive clawed hand swiped at him. Searing pain exploded across Chris's chest as the creature's razor-sharp claws ripped through his jacket and the flesh beneath. He stumbled backward, gasping in agony. "Chris!" Rachel's voice, weak but alive, cut through the haze of pain. "Run. Please, just run." Her words galvanized him. Chris looked up to see Rachel struggling to her feet, her face pale and bruised but her eyes blazing with determination. "I'm not leaving you!" Chris shouted back, dodging another swipe from the Bigfoot. He circled around, trying to position himself between the creature and Rachel. The Bigfoot roared again, beating its chest in a display of primal power. Then it charged. Chris swung his branch desperately, but the creature batted it aside as if it were nothing more than a twig. Massive hands closed around Chris's throat, lifting him off the ground. "No!" Rachel screamed. From the corner of his eye, Chris saw her pick up a rock and hurl it at the Bigfoot's head. The stone struck home, causing the creature to loosen its grip, just enough for Chris to draw a ragged breath. He kicked out with all his strength, his boot connecting with the Bigfoot's knee. There was a sickening crack, and the creature howled in pain. It dropped Chris, who crumpled to the ground, coughing and gasping. "Chris!" Rachel was at his side in an instant, her hands frantically checking him for injuries. "Oh God, you're bleeding. We need to get out of here." Chris nodded weakly, allowing Rachel to help him to his feet. But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked. The Bigfoot, its eyes now glowing with an almost hellish light, stood between them and escape. "Rachel," Chris whispered, pushing her behind him. "When I say go, run up the ravine. Don't look back, just run." "I'm not leaving you," Rachel hissed back, her fingers digging into his arm. The Bigfoot took a lumbering step forward, favoring its injured leg, but no less terrifying for it. Chris tensed, ready to make his final stand. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A low rumble filled the air, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. "Landslide!" Chris yelled, recognizing the danger an instant before it struck. A wall of mud, rocks, and fallen trees came crashing down the side of the ravine. Chris grabbed Rachel and dove to the side, narrowly avoiding being crushed. The Bigfoot wasn't so lucky. It roared in surprise and fear as the debris struck it, sweeping it off its feet. In seconds, it was buried under tons of earth and stone. Chris and Rachel clung to each other as the world shook around them. When the dust finally settled, they found themselves trapped in a small hollow formed by fallen trees. "Are you okay?" Chris asked, his voice hoarse. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide with shock. "I think so. You?" "I'll live." Chris grimaced, the pain from his various injuries making itself known now that the immediate danger had passed. "We need to get out of here before that thing digs itself out." They worked together to shift the debris, creating a small opening. Chris helped Rachel through first, then squeezed out himself, biting back a cry of pain as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. As they clambered up the side of the ravine, Chris couldn't resist looking back. The landslide had completely transformed the area, burying everything under a thick layer of mud and broken trees. There was no sign of the Bigfoot. "Do you think it's dead?" Rachel asked, following his gaze. Chris shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I'm not sticking around to find out." They reached the top of the ravine and paused to catch their breath. The forest stretched out before them, seemingly peaceful in the late morning light. But Chris knew the danger was far from over. "We need to keep moving," he said, wincing as he tried to rotate his injured shoulder. "Find help or at least get back to civilization." Rachel nodded, her face set in grim determination. "Which way?" Chris scanned the horizon, trying to get his bearings. "East, I think. If we keep the sun on our right, we should eventually hit a road or a town." As they set off into the forest, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of the Bigfoot's return. "Chris," Rachel said softly as they walked, What if it comes back? What if there are more of them out there?" Chris squeezed her hand reassuringly, even as doubt gnawed at his own heart. Then we'll face it together. We've made it this far, right? Rachel managed a weak smile, but her eyes remained haunted. As they pushed deeper into the forest, the events of the past few hours replayed in Chris's mind. The attack, the chase, the narrow escape, it all seemed like a nightmare. But the pain in his body and the terror in Rachel's eyes were all too real. Whatever happened next, Chris knew their lives would never be the same. The forest held secrets darker and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. And somewhere out there, buried under mud and stone, a monster waited. Whether dead or alive, its presence would haunt them forever. The forest had never seemed so dark, so oppressive. Chris stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood trickled down his face from a cut above his eye, mixing with the cold sweat of fear. "Rachel," he called out, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Rachel, where are you?" Only the eerie silence of the woods answered him. Chris paused, leaning against a tree trunk to catch his breath. His dislocated shoulder throbbed with every movement, and the gashes across his chest from the Bigfoot's claws burned like fire. "Think, Chris," he muttered to himself. "You can't help Rachel if you lose your head." He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, praying that it had somehow survived the ordeal. The cracked screen flickered to life, casting a weak glow in the darkness. No signal, of course, but the flashlight still worked. Chris swept the beam around, trying to get his bearings. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He had no idea how far he'd run after the landslide separated him from Rachel. A twig snapped somewhere to his left, and Chris whirled around, his heart pounding. The flashlight beam danced wildly across the foliage, creating shifting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. "Rachel," he called out, hope and fear warring in his voice. "Is that you?" Silence. Then another snap, closer this time. Chris backed away slowly, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. Was it the Bigfoot, somehow having survived the landslide, or something else entirely? "Show yourself," Chris shouted, trying to sound braver than he felt. A rustling in the bushes, and then a raccoon scurried out, its eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. Chris let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through him. "Get it together, man," he chided himself. "You're jumping at shadows." But the relief was short-lived. The raccoon's appearance had reminded Chris of a chilling fact. These woods were home to more than just Bigfoot. Mountain lions, bears, and who knew what else lurked in the darkness. And Rachel was out there, alone and possibly injured. With renewed determination, Chris pushed on. He had to find her, had to get them both out of this nightmare. The beam of his flashlight swept back and forth as he walked, searching for any sign of Rachel's passage. Hours seemed to pass, though Chris's phone told him it had only been 45 minutes. Every tree, every rock started to look the same. Was he going in circles? The thought sent a chill down his spine. "Rachel!" he called again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Can you hear me? Make a sound, anything." As if in answer, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. Chris froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. That was no raccoon. Slowly he turned, sweeping the flashlight beam in a wide arc. There, at the edge of the light, he caught a glimpse of movement. Something large, something that walked on two legs. "No," Chris whispered. "It can't be." But it was. The Bigfoot emerged from the shadows, its fur matted with mud and blood from the landslide. One arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, but its eyes blazed with the same terrifying intelligence Chris had seen before. Chris didn't think. He ran. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. Behind him, he could hear the creature's labored breathing, the thud of its massive feet against the forest floor. "Rachel!" Chris screamed as he ran. "Rachel, run! It's still alive!" He burst into a small clearing and skidded to a stop, horror freezing him in place. The ground was littered with bones, deer, bear, and oh God, were those human? Tattered scraps of clothing hung from the surrounding bushes like macabre decorations. No, 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 Chris muttered, backing away. This was the creature's lair, its killing ground. And Rachel? A glint of something caught his eye. Chris swung the flashlight beam towards it and his heart nearly stopped. There, caught on a thorny bush, was a long strand of blonde hair. Rachel's hair. "Rachel!" he cried out, rushing towards the bush. "Rachel! Are you here?" But there was no answer. Chris carefully untangled the hair from the thorns, holding it like it was the most precious thing in the world. It was proof that Rachel had been here, that she might still be alive. The sound of heavy breathing reminded Chris of his pursuer. He whirled around, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The Bigfoot stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. It seemed to be studying Chris, its head tilted to one side, in an almost curious manner. "Where is she?" Chris demanded, his voice shaking with fear and rage. "What have you done with Rachel?" The creature took a lumbering step forward, and Chris scrambled backward, nearly tripping over a pile of bones. His back hit a tree and he realized with dawning horror that he was trapped. But then, something unexpected happened. The Bigfoot stopped. It raised its uninjured arm, pointing deeper into the forest. Then, to Chris's utter astonishment, it spoke. The sound was guttural, barely recognizable as language, but Chris could have sworn it said, "Woman. There." Chris blinked, sure he was hallucinating. "What? What did you say?" The creature repeated the gesture, more insistently this time. "Woman. There. Go." Was it helping him? Chris's mind reeled, unable to process this new development. But if there was even a chance that the creature was pointing him towards Rachel? "Why?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" The Bigfoot's expression, if it could be called that, seemed to soften. It thumped its chest with its good arm, then pointed at Chris. "Same. Protect, mate." Chris felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. This creature, this monster that had terrorized them, was capable of empathy, of communication. It was almost too much to comprehend, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. If Rachel was where the creature said she was, every second counted. Chris nodded slowly, still keeping his distance from the Bigfoot. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. I'm sorry about your arm." The creature made a dismissive gesture, then turned and lumbered back into the forest, leaving Chris alone in the clearing. For a moment, Chris stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Then, shaking himself out of his daze, he set off in the direction the Bigfoot had indicated. As he walked, his mind raced. If the creature could speak, could reason, what did that mean? Were there more like it out there? And how would the world react if they knew? But those were questions for later. Right now, all that mattered was finding Rachel. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the canopy. Chris quickened his pace, hope giving him renewed energy. But as the forest grew brighter, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Nothing looked familiar. The trees, the rocks, the lay of the land, it was all alien to him. With a growing sense of dread, Chris realized he was hopelessly lost. "No," he muttered, spinning in a circle. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." He was in Bigfoot territory now, deep in a part of the forest few humans had ever seen. And somewhere out there, Rachel was waiting for him. Chris sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the enormity of his situation. He was injured, lost, and alone in a forest that held dangers beyond his wildest imagination. And the woman he loved was out there somewhere, possibly hurt, possibly... No, he couldn't think like that. Rachel was alive. She had to be. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the forest in hues of gold and green, Chris made a decision. He would not give up. He would find Rachel no matter what it took. He struggled to his feet, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "I'm coming, Rachel," he said, his voice strong and determined. "Just hold on. I'll find you." With one last look around, Chris chose a direction and started walking. He didn't know what dangers lay ahead, what other secrets this forest might hold. But he knew one thing for certain. He would not rest until Rachel was safe in his arms again. As he walked, Chris couldn't shake the memory of the Bigfoot's words. Same. Protect, mate. It was a reminder that even in the darkest, most terrifying situations, a spark of humanity, or something like it, could be found. The search was far from over. In fact, Chris realized it was only just beginning. But with each step, he was one step closer to Rachel, one step closer to answers, and one step closer to a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about the world. The forest stretched out before him, vast and mysterious, and somewhere in its depths, Rachel waited. Chris took a deep breath, squared his shoulders despite the pain, and plunged deeper into the unknown. The hunt was on, and Chris was determined to see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. Chris's legs trembled with exhaustion as he pushed through the dense underbrush. Hours of searching for Rachel had left him physically and emotionally drained. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, but they brought little comfort to his increasingly desperate situation. "Rachel," he called out, his voice hoarse from overuse. "Rachel, please, where are you?" Only the chirping of early morning birds answered his plea. Chris leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath. His dislocated shoulder throbbed relentlessly, and the gashes on his chest from the Bigfoot's claws stung with every movement. "Think, Chris," he muttered to himself. "Where would she go? Where would I go if I were lost and scared?" As he stood there, contemplating his next move, a sound reached his ears that made his blood run cold. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, punctuated by the snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves. Something big was moving through the forest, and it was coming his way. "No," Chris whispered, his eyes widening in fear. "Not again, please. Not again." He pushed off from the tree, forcing his tired legs into motion. The breathing grew louder, closer. Chris didn't dare look back, focusing all his energy on putting one foot in front of the other. But his body had reached its limit. As he leapt over a fallen log, his legs finally gave out. Chris crashed to the ground, crying out in pain as he landed on his injured shoulder. "Get up!" he screamed at himself, scrambling to regain his footing. "Get up, damn it!" The creature's breathing was right behind him now. Chris could almost feel its hot breath on the back of his neck. In a desperate move, he threw himself forward, rolling down a steep embankment he hadn't even noticed in his panic. The world became a dizzying blur of green and brown as Chris tumbled down the slope. Rocks and branches tore at his skin, adding fresh cuts and bruises to his already battered body. He cried out in pain, but couldn't stop his descent. After what felt like an eternity, Chris came to a stop at the bottom of the embankment. He lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, his entire body screaming in agony. "Oh God," he groaned, slowly pushing himself up on his good arm. "Rachel, I'm sorry. I can't." But as he raised his head, a sound reached his ears that cut through the fog of pain and despair. The rush of running water. Hope surged through Chris's veins like an electric current. Water meant a river, and a river meant a potential escape route. With renewed determination, he staggered to his feet. "Come on," he urged himself. "You can do this. For Rachel." Chris stumbled forward, following the sound of the water. The undergrowth thinned out, and suddenly, he found himself on the bank of a raging river. The water churned and frothed, swollen from recent rains. For a moment, Chris hesitated. The current looked treacherous, capable of sweeping him away in an instant. But then a roar echoed through the trees behind him, and he knew he was out of options. "Here goes nothing," Chris muttered, taking a deep breath. He plunged into the icy water, gasping as the cold shocked his system. The current immediately grabbed him, pulling him downstream with frightening speed. Chris fought to keep his head above water, his injured shoulder making it difficult to swim. "Rachel," he shouted between gasps for air. "Rachel, if you can hear me, I'm coming." The river carried him swiftly through the forest, the banks blurring into a green smear. Chris struggled against the current, trying to angle himself towards the shore. But the water was relentless, tossing him about like a rag doll. Just when he thought he couldn't hold on any longer, Chris spotted a low-hanging branch jutting out over the water. With the last of his strength, he reached out and grabbed it. The force of the current threatened to tear him away, but Chris held on with grim determination. Inch by agonizing inch, he pulled himself towards the shore. Finally, his feet found purchase on the muddy bank. Chris dragged himself out of the water, collapsing on the riverbank. He lay there for several minutes, coughing and gasping, his body shivering uncontrollably. "I made it," he wheezed, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. "I actually made it." But his relief was short-lived. As Chris raised his head to survey his surroundings, his blood ran cold. There, on the opposite bank, stood the BigFoot. Its massive form was unmistakable, even at this distance. Chris froze, not daring to move a muscle. The creature stood perfectly still, its glowing eyes fixed on him. For a long moment they stared at each other across the churning water. Then, to Chris's amazement, the BigFoot raised a hand in what almost looked like a wave. It grunted something that was lost in the roar of the river, then turned and disappeared into the tree line. Chris blinked, unsure if he had imagined the whole thing. "What the hell?" he muttered. Shaking his head in disbelief, Chris struggled to his feet. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to him like a second skin. But he was alive, and for now, that was enough. "Rachel," he said, his determination returning. "I'm still coming for you, just hold on." Chris took stock of his surroundings. The river had carried him quite a distance, and nothing looked familiar. But at least now he had a landmark to follow. If he stayed near the river, he reasoned, he'd eventually find signs of civilization. As he started to walk along the riverbank, a glint of something metallic caught his eye. Chris hurried over to investigate, his heart racing with hope. There, half buried in the mud, was a small silver locket. With trembling fingers, Chris picked it up and opened it. Inside was a tiny photo of himself and Rachel, taken on their first date. "Oh my God," Chris breathed, clutching the locket to his chest. Rachel was here. She made it to the river too. New energy coursed through him. Rachel was alive, and she had passed this way. He was on the right track. "Rachel," he called out, his voice echoing across the water. "Rachel, I found your locket. I'm coming for you." Chris set off downstream with renewed vigor, his eyes scanning the riverbank for any more signs of Rachel's passage. As he walked, he couldn't shake the memory of the BigFoot's strange behavior. First, it had seemed to help him in the clearing, and now this almost friendly gesture across the river. What did it mean? "Focus, Chris," he muttered to himself. "Find Rachel first. Worry about the Sasquatch's feelings later." The sun climbed higher in the sky as Chris made his way along the river. Despite his exhaustion and injuries, he pressed on, driven by the hope that each step brought him closer to Rachel. As he rounded a bend in the river, Chris spotted something that made his heart leap. There, on a sandy stretch of shore, was a clear footprint. A human footprint. "Rachel!" he shouted, rushing forward to examine the print. It was the right size, and the pattern matched the hiking boots Rachel had been wearing. Chris looked up, scanning the area frantically. "Rachel, are you here? Can you hear me?" A faint sound reached his ears, barely audible over the rush of the river. Was that a voice? "Rachel?" Chris called again, straining to hear. This time the response was clearer. "Chris? Chris, is that you?" Chris's heart soared. It was Rachel's voice, weak but unmistakable. "Rachel, where are you? Keep talking." He crashed through the underbrush, following the sound of Rachel's voice. As he pushed through a dense thicket, he finally saw her. Rachel was huddled at the base of a large tree, her clothes torn and dirty, her face pale with exhaustion. But she was alive. "Chris!" she cried out, struggling to her feet. Chris rushed to her, enveloping her in a tight embrace despite the pain from his injuries. "Rachel," "Oh my God, Rachel. You're alive. You're okay." They clung to each other, both sobbing with relief and pent-up fear. After a long moment, Chris pulled back, cupping Rachel's face in his hands. "Are you hurt? What happened? How did you escape?" The questions tumbled out of him in a rush. Rachel shook her head, her eyes wide with residual fear. I'm not sure. After the landslide, I was lost. I kept running, and then I found the river. I thought if I followed it..." She trailed off, her gaze distant. "Chris, I saw it again. The creature. It was watching me, but it didn't attack. It just let me go." Chris nodded slowly, remembering his own strange encounters. "I know. I saw it too. Rachel, I think it might be more intelligent than we realized. It spoke to me." Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. "Spoke? What do you mean?" Before Chris could answer, a low rumble echoed through the forest. They both tensed, instinctively drawing closer to each other. "We need to get out of here," Chris said urgently. "Can you walk?" Rachel nodded, though she leaned heavily on Chris for support. "I think so. But where do we go?" Chris looked around, trying to get his bearings. "We follow the river. It has to lead somewhere, right? Civilization, a road, something." As they set off downstream, supporting each other, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced back over his shoulder, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw two glowing eyes peering out from the tree line. But when he looked again, they were gone. "What is it?" Rachel asked, noticing his distraction. Chris shook his head, tightening his arm around her waist. "Nothing, just shadows. Come on, let's keep moving." As they made their way along the riverbank, Chris's mind raced. They had survived their encounter with the Bigfoot, but at what cost? And what would happen when they returned to civilization with their incredible story? One thing was certain: their lives would never be the same. The forest had revealed its secrets to them, and now they carried a truth that would change everything. But for now, all that mattered was that they were together, alive, and on their way home. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless sea of green that threatened to swallow Chris whole. His legs moved mechanically, one foot in front of the other, driven by sheer willpower rather than any remaining strength. His clothes, still damp from his plunge into the river, clung to his skin, chafing with every step. The gashes on his chest burned, and his dislocated shoulder throbbed in time with his ragged heartbeat. "Just a little further," Chris panted, more to himself than to Rachel, who leaned heavily against him. Rachel didn't respond. She hadn't spoken in hours, her face a mask of exhaustion and shock. Chris wanted to stop, to rest, but fear kept him moving. Fear of what might still be lurking in the shadows of the forest. The sound of the river had faded to a distant murmur, but Chris kept it within earshot. It was their lifeline, their only hope of finding their way back to civilization. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a new sound reached Chris's ears. At first he thought he was hallucinating, his mind playing cruel tricks after days of terror and exhaustion. But as they crested a small hill, the sound became clearer. Voices. Human voices. "Rachel," Chris croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Rachel, do you hear that?" Rachel lifted her head slowly, her eyes unfocused. "What?" "Listen," Chris urged. "People. We're close to the trail." A spark of life returned to Rachel's eyes. "People?" she whispered. "Really?" Chris nodded, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. Yeah, we made it. We're going to be okay." With renewed energy, they pushed forward. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. As they broke through a line of trees, Chris's heart leapt. There, not 50 yards away, was a well-maintained hiking trail. And on that trail was a hiker, a young woman with a bright red backpack and a look of absolute horror on her face as she caught sight of them. "Oh my God," the woman cried out, rushing towards them. "Are you okay? What happened?" Chris opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Now that they were safe, now that the nightmare was over, the full weight of their ordeal came crashing down on him. His legs gave out, and he sank to the ground, bringing Rachel down with him. "Monster," he managed to croak out. There was a monster in the woods. The hiker's eyes widened in alarm. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. "Yes, emergency services? I need help on the Pinewood Trail, about 2 miles from the ranger station. I've found 2 hikers, they're injured and in shock. They're saying something about a monster." As the hiker relayed their location to the emergency operator, Chris held Rachel close, murmuring reassurances. "We're safe now," he whispered. "It's over. We're going to be okay." But even as he said the words, a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkening forest, a pair of glowing eyes were watching them. The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, concerned voices, and probing hands. Chris vaguely remembered being loaded into an ambulance, the paramedics' voices seeming to come from far away as they assessed his injuries. Multiple lacerations, possible concussion, shoulder dislocation. He tried to focus, to tell them about Rachel, about the creature in the woods, but exhaustion pulled him under, dragging him into a fitful sleep filled with nightmarish visions of glowing eyes and massive fur-covered forms. When Chris awoke, he found himself in a hospital bed, the steady beep of a heart monitor filling the room. Sunlight streamed through a window, suggesting he'd been out for hours. As his eyes adjusted to the brightness, he became aware of a figure sitting in a chair beside his bed. "Rachel?" he mumbled, his voice rough. The figure leaned forward, and Chris's heart sank. It wasn't Rachel, but a man in a park ranger uniform, his face creased with concern and something else. Skepticism. "Mr. Thompson," the ranger said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm Ranger Mike Holloway. How are you feeling?" Chris struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. "Where's Rachel? Is she okay?" Ranger Holloway held up a placating hand. "Ms. Carter is fine. She's in another room, being treated for dehydration and minor injuries. Now, Mr. Thompson, can you tell me what happened out there?" Chris took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Where did he even begin? How could he explain the terror, the impossibility of what they'd encountered? We were attacked," he started hesitantly. "In the woods, there was this creature, massive, covered in fur, like a BigFoot but real. It took Rachel and I went after it. We got separated and then..." He trailed off, noting the growing skepticism in the ranger's eyes. "A BigFoot," Ranger Holloway repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Thompson, you were missing for 3 days in some of the most challenging terrains in the state. You were severely dehydrated and injured. Are you sure you didn't imagine this creature?" Chris felt a flash of anger cut through his exhaustion. "Imagine it? You think I did this to myself?" He gestured to his bandaged chest and immobilized shoulder. "That I imagined something that could do this?" The ranger sighed, jotting something down in a small notebook. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but we've searched those woods for years and we've never found any evidence of large, unidentified creatures. Perhaps you encountered a bear, or..." "It wasn't a bear," Chris snapped, his heart rate spiking. The monitor beside him began to beat more rapidly. "It walked on 2 legs. It spoke to me." As soon as the words left his mouth, Chris regretted them. The look on Ranger Holloway's face shifted from skepticism to outright disbelief. "It spoke to you," the ranger repeated slowly. "Mr. Thompson, I think you need to rest. We can continue this conversation when you're feeling better." Before Chris could protest, a nurse entered the room, alerted by his elevated heart rate. "Everything okay in here?" she asked, eyeing the ranger suspiciously. "We're fine," Ranger Holloway said, standing up. "I was just leaving." Mr. Thompson needs his rest." As the ranger left, the nurse busied herself checking Chris's vitals. "Try not to get too excited," she admonished gently. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Chris wanted to laugh. An ordeal. That was one way to put it. As the nurse adjusted his IV, a thought struck him. "My phone," he said suddenly. "Where's my phone?" The nurse frowned. "I'm not sure. Your personal effects would have been collected when you were admitted. Why?" "I took pictures," Chris explained, a surge of hope rising in his chest. "In the woods, of the footprints, the claw marks. I have proof." The nurse patted his arm sympathetically. "I'm sure the police will look into all of that. For now, you need to rest." But rest was the last thing on Chris's mind. As soon as the nurse left, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, gritting his teeth against the pain. He had to find his phone, had to show them the evidence before they wrote him off as some lunatic who got lost in the woods. Chris made it as far as the door before a wave of dizziness hit him. He leaned against the doorframe, taking deep breaths. The hallway swam before his eyes, and every noise made him flinch. The squeak of a passing gurney became the growl of the creature. The shadow of a potted plant transformed into a hulking, fur-covered form. "Get a grip," Chris muttered to himself. "You're safe now. It's over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. It wouldn't be over until someone believed him, until they found proof of the creature's existence. And what if there were more of them out there? What if they decided to venture closer to civilization? A hand on his shoulder made Chris jump, a strangled cry escaping his lips. "Whoa, easy there," a deep voice said. Chris turned to find himself face to face with a tall, broad-shouldered man in a police uniform. "Detective Mark Ramirez," the man introduced himself. "I was just coming to talk to you, Mr. Thompson. Why don't we get you back to bed?" Chris allowed the detective to guide him back to the bed, his mind racing. This was his chance to make someone understand, to make them believe. As Chris settled back against the pillows, Detective Ramirez pulled up a chair. "Now, Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice professional but not unkind. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened out there in the woods. Don't leave anything out, no matter how unusual it might seem." Chris took a deep breath and began his story. He told the detective everything, from the initial attack to their desperate escape down the river. He described the creature in as much detail as he could remember, its massive size, its glowing eyes, the intelligence behind those eyes. He even told him about the creature's apparent ability to speak, though he could see the doubt creeping into the detective's expression. When he finished, Detective Ramirez was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. "That's quite a story, Mr. Thompson," he said finally. "It's the truth," Chris insisted. "I know how it sounds, but I'm not crazy. Rachel saw it too, and I have proof. There are pictures on my phone if I can just..." Detective Ramirez held up a hand. "We'll get to your phone, don't worry. But first I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that?" Chris nodded, a knot forming in his stomach. "Before you went on this hiking trip, had you or Ms. Carter consumed any drugs or alcohol?" The question hit Chris like a slap in the face. "What? No. We're not..." "It's a standard question, Mr. Thompson," the detective said calmly. "We have to consider all possibilities. Now, you mentioned that you and Ms. Carter were separated for a time. Can you tell me exactly what happened during that period?" Chris frowned, trying to recall the blur of terror and exhaustion. I was looking for her. I followed the river, thinking she might have gone that way. Then I found her locket, and eventually I found her." "And during this time, did you experience any hallucinations? Any periods where you can't quite remember what happened?" The implications of the detective's questions began to dawn on Chris, and he felt a surge of anger and despair. "You think I did something to Rachel?" he said flatly. "You think I hurt her and made up this story to cover it up?" Detective Ramirez's face remained impassive. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Mr. Thompson. I'm just trying to establish the facts." "The facts?" Chris laughed bitterly. The facts are that there's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. And instead of trying to find it to protect people, you're in here accusing me of… What? Assaulting my girlfriend? The detective sighed, jotting something down in his notebook. Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes, when we go through something like that, our minds can play tricks on us. It's possible that in the stress and confusion of being lost in the woods, you might have… I didn't imagine it, Chris shouted, his frustration boiling over. I'm not crazy. Why won't anyone believe me? The outburst seemed to echo in the small hospital room. Detective Ramirez stood up slowly, his hand moving instinctively towards his hip. I think that's enough for now, he said quietly. Get some rest, Mr. Thompson. We'll talk again when you're feeling calmer. As the detective left, Chris slumped back against the pillows, a wave of despair washing over him. They didn't believe him. No one believed him. And why should they? A monster in the woods? A BigFoot that could speak? He could hardly believe it himself, and he'd lived through it. Hours passed, marked only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and the occasional visit from a nurse. Chris drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with shadows and glowing eyes. Each time he woke, he half expected to find himself back in the forest, the creature looming over him. It was late afternoon when a commotion in the hallway roused Chris from a fitful doze. He heard raised voices, one of which he recognized with a jolt. I don't care about your procedures, that's our daughter in there and we demand to see her. The door burst open, and two people rushed in, a tall, distinguished-looking man with graying hair, and a petite woman with Rachel's blonde hair and blue eyes. Rachel's parents. They stopped short when they saw Chris, their expressions a mix of confusion and anger. You, Rachel's father said, his voice low and dangerous. What have you done to our daughter? Chris struggled to sit up, his heart racing. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, Rachel's okay. She's in another room. I would never hurt her. Rachel's mother stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Then where is she? Why isn't she with you? What happened out there? The questions came rapid fire, each one hitting Chris like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could he tell them about the creature when even the police didn't believe him? There was something in the woods, he managed finally. It attacked us. We got separated. I searched for her, I found her, we escaped together. Rachel's father scoffed. Something in the woods? What does that mean? A bear? A mountain lion? Chris shook his head, frustration building. No, it was bigger, like a BigFoot. The moment the word left his mouth, Chris knew it was a mistake. Rachel's parents exchanged a look of disbelief and growing anger. A BigFoot, Rachel's mother repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you think this is funny, Chris? Our daughter is lying in a hospital bed traumatized and you're telling us fairy tales? It's not a fairy tale, Chris insisted, his voice rising. I know how it sounds, but it's the truth. Ask Rachel, she saw it too. Rachel's father stepped closer to the bed, his face thunderous. Our daughter is too upset to speak coherently. She keeps talking about monsters and glowing eyes. What did you do to her out there? What kind of sick game were you playing? The accusation hit Chris like a physical blow. He felt tears of frustration welling up in his eyes. I would never hurt Rachel. I love her. I was trying to protect her. But he could see the disbelief in their eyes, the growing certainty that he was either lying or delusional. Rachel's mother turned away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her father continued to glare at Chris, his gaze boring into him. We trusted you with our daughter, he said, his voice low and filled with barely contained rage. If we find out you've done anything to harm her… He left the threat unfinished, but Chris could feel the weight of it settling over him like a shroud. As Rachel's parents left the room, presumably to find their daughter, Chris felt a wave of despair wash over him. No one believed him. Not the park ranger, not the detective, not even Rachel's parents. They all thought he was either lying or crazy. And Rachel? Where was she? Why hadn't she told them the truth? Chris sank back against the pillows, his mind racing. He had to find a way to prove what had happened, to make them understand the danger that still lurked in those woods. But how? His phone was gone, probably locked away as evidence. Rachel was somewhere in the hospital, but he had no way to reach her. As the sun began to set outside his window, casting long shadows across the room, Chris felt a chill run down his spine. Every flicker of movement, every unexpected sound made him flinch. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the creature was still out there, watching and waiting. In the growing darkness of the hospital room, Chris Thompson faced a terrifying realization. He had escaped the monster in the woods, only to find himself trapped in a different kind of nightmare, one where the truth sounded like madness and no one would believe him. The crisp mountain air, once invigorating, now felt oppressive as it filled Mark's lungs. He stood at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by a motley crew of park rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him like accusing fingers. "This is where it happened," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured toward the center of the clearing where their tents had once stood. Now there was nothing but undisturbed grass and wildflowers. No blood, no torn fabric, no sign of the horror that had unfolded just days ago. Sheriff Tom Hawkins, a grizzled man with a perpetual scowl, stepped forward. "And you're sure this is the exact spot, Mr. Thompson?" Mark nodded emphatically. "Positive. We set up camp right here. Rachel's tent was there." He pointed to a patch of purple lupines. "And mine was over by that fallen log." The sheriff exchanged a skeptical glance with his deputy before turning back to Mark. "Well, I'm not seeing anything that corroborates your story. No tracks, no blood, no signs of a struggle. Hell, there's not even any proof you two camped here at all." "That's impossible," Mark protested, his voice rising. "There was blood everywhere. The tents were shredded. Rachel was—" He choked on the words. The image of her mangled body seared into his memory. A park ranger, a young woman named Sarah, approached with a look of concern. "Mr. Thompson, are you absolutely certain this is the right location? Sometimes in times of stress, our memories can play tricks on us." Mark whirled to face her, frustration boiling over. "I'm not confused. I'm not crazy. We were right here. And that thing attacked us. It killed Rachel, and it nearly killed me too." His outburst was met with uncomfortable silence. The search party members avoided eye contact, some shuffling their feet awkwardly. Sheriff Hawkins cleared his throat. "Look, son, I know you've been through a traumatic experience, but right now we've got a missing person to find. If Rachel's out there hurt, every minute counts. So why don't you sit down for a bit, clear your head, and let us do our job." Mark opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. He nodded tersely and retreated to a nearby stump, watching as the search party fanned out across the clearing. For hours, they combed the area, looking for any sign of Rachel or evidence of an attack. Mark's heart sank with each passing minute as it became clear they would find nothing. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Sheriff Hawkins called the search to a halt. He approached Mark, who hadn't moved from his perch on the stump. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to level with you," the sheriff said, his tone grave. "We've found absolutely nothing to support your story. No blood, no torn clothing, no tracks, human or animal. Now, I'm not saying you're lying, but something doesn't add up here." Mark looked up, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair. "What are you saying?" The sheriff sighed heavily. "I'm saying that as of right now, this is still a missing persons case. But given the lack of evidence and the unusual nature of your account, we're going to need to investigate all possibilities." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "You think I did something to Rachel?" "I didn't say that," Hawkins replied carefully. "But we need to cover all our bases. I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a full statement. And We'll need to run some tests." "Tests? What kind of tests?" Mark asked, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "Standard procedure," the sheriff assured him. "Tox screen mainly, just to rule things out." Mark's mind raced. He knew he hadn't done anything to Rachel, but would they believe him? As the gravity of his situation began to sink in, he nodded numbly and allowed himself to be led to a waiting police cruiser. The ride to the small town of Pine Ridge was silent and tense. Mark stared out the window, watching the dense forest give way to scattered houses and eventually the main street of the sleepy mountain community. The police station was a squat brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Inside, Mark was ushered into a small, windowless room. The walls were a dingy off-white, adorned only with a large mirror that he assumed was two-way. He sat at a metal table, its surface scarred with years of use. Hours passed as Mark recounted his story over and over. With each retelling, he could see the doubt growing in the eyes of his interrogators. They pressed him on every detail, looking for inconsistencies, probing for weaknesses in his narrative. "So, this creature," Detective Lisa Chen said, leaning forward with an arched eyebrow. "Can you describe it again?" Mark closed his eyes, summoning the terrifying image. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur, dark, almost black, but its face... He shuddered. Its face was almost human, but wrong. The eyes were too big, too intelligent. And its mouth... God, its mouth was full of razor-sharp teeth. Detective Chen exchanged a glance with Sheriff Hawkins before continuing. "Mr. Thompson, are you familiar with the local wildlife in these parts?" "Of course," Mark replied. "I've been camping in these mountains for years." "Then you know we have bears, mountain lions, animals that could potentially attack a campsite?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. I know what I saw." The detective's voice softened. "Mark, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially in high-stress situations. Is it possible that in the darkness, in the heat of the moment, you might have mistaken a large animal for something else?" "No," Mark said firmly. "Absolutely not. I know what I saw." The questioning continued for what felt like hours. By the time they finally let him go, the sun had long since set. Mark stepped out into the cool night air, his head spinning. As he walked down the empty main street, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The next morning, Mark awoke in his motel room to a pounding headache and a sense of dread. He fumbled for the TV remote, clicking it onto the local news channel. The anchor's voice filled the small room. In a shocking development in the disappearance of Rachel Winters, toxicology reports have revealed the presence of psilocybin, the active compound found in hallucinogenic mushrooms, in the system of Mark Thompson, the last person to see Ms. Winters alive. Mark's blood ran cold. He remembered the wild mushrooms they had eaten with their dinner the night before the attack. Had they really been psychedelic? But that was impossible. He knew the difference between edible and poisonous fungi. The news report continued. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Mr. Thompson may have experienced a psychotic episode induced by the hallucinogenic substances, potentially leading to violence against Ms. Winters. While no charges have been filed at this time, Mr. Thompson remains a person of interest in the case. No, Mark muttered, running his hands through his hair. This couldn't be happening. How could they think he had anything to do with Rachel's disappearance? A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Sarah, the park ranger from yesterday's search. "Mark? Can I come in?" she asked, her expression a mix of concern and wariness. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter the small motel room. Sarah's eyes darted to the TV, where the news report was still playing, before settling back on Mark. "I saw the news," she said softly. I wanted to check on you." Mark slumped onto the bed, his head in his hands. "They think I did it. They think I killed Rachel." Sarah sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "Mark, I've been a ranger in these parts for 5 years. I've seen what the wilderness can do to people's minds, the isolation, the darkness, and it can play tricks on you. You don't believe me either, Mark said, his voice hollow. Sarah hesitated before responding. I believe that you believe what you're saying. But Mark, we didn't find any evidence to support your story. And now with these toxicology results... I didn't take any drugs, Mark exploded, jumping to his feet. And I sure as hell didn't hurt Rachel. Sarah held up her hands in a placating gesture. Okay. Let's say for a moment that everything happened exactly as you remember it. Can you think of any reason why there wouldn't be any physical evidence left behind? Mark paced the small room, his mind racing. I don't know, it doesn't make any sense. There was so much blood, Sarah. The tents were destroyed. How could it all just vanish? That's what we're trying to figure out, Sarah replied gently. Mark, I want to help you, but you need to work with us. Is there anything at all, that you might have left out or forgotten to mention? Mark was about to shake his head when a thought struck him. He rushed to his backpack, rummaging through it until he found his sketchbook. The creature, he said, flipping through the pages. I've been trying to draw it, to get it out of my head. He handed the sketchbook to Sarah, who began to leaf through the pages. Her brow furrowed as she examined the drawings. Mark, these are all quite different, she said carefully. What? No, they're not. They're all of the same thing, Mark insisted, looking over her shoulder. Sarah held up the book, displaying several pages side by side. Look closely. This one has a much more elongated snout. This one's eyes are set wider apart. And this one, well, it looks almost entirely human. Mark stared at the drawings, a chill running down his spine. She was right. Each sketch was subtly different, with some looking more bestial and others disturbingly human-like. How had he not noticed this before? I don't understand, he stammered. They all look the same when I drew them, I swear. Sarah closed the sketchbook gently. Mark, I think you should consider talking to someone, a professional. There are trauma counselors who specialize in... I'm not crazy, Mark snapped, snatching the sketchbook back. I know what I saw. I know what happened to Rachel. Why won't anyone believe me? Sarah stood, moving towards the door. I'm sorry, Mark. I really am. But until we find some concrete evidence, all we have is your word. And right now, that's not enough. As she left, Mark felt the walls of the small motel room closing in around him. He was alone, truly alone, with no one believing his story. The creature that had taken Rachel was still out there, and he was the only one who knew the truth. Over the next few days, Mark's world unraveled at an alarming pace. News reports painted him as either a deranged drug user or a cold-blooded killer. His face was plastered across local newspapers and TV stations, always accompanied by phrases like person of interest and prime suspect. He couldn't go anywhere in town without feeling the weight of suspicious stares. Whispers followed him down the street, in the diner where he forced himself to eat, even in the motel where he'd holed up. One afternoon, as Mark sat in a booth at the local diner, picking at a plate of untouched food, he overheard a conversation from the next table. I always thought there was something off about him, a woman's voice said in a stage whisper. The way he'd go off into the woods for weeks at a time. Who knows what he was really doing out there? Probably growing those mushrooms, her companion replied. Bet that's how he lured that poor girl out there. Drugged her up and then... The man made a slashing motion across his throat. Mark's hand tightened around his fork, knuckles turning white. He wanted to stand up, to shout at them, to make them understand. But he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he threw some money on the table and hurried out, ignoring the sudden hush that fell over the diner as he passed. Back in his motel room, Mark paced like a caged animal. The walls seemed to be closing in, suffocating him with each passing moment. He needed to do something, anything, to prove his innocence and find out what really happened to Rachel. In a burst of desperate energy, he grabbed his sketchbook and began to draw. Page after page filled with images of the creature, each one more detailed than the last. He drew until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, pouring every ounce of his memory onto the paper. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Mark finally set down his pencil. He looked at the drawings spread out before him and felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah had been right. They were all different. Some looked almost bear-like, others more akin to a mountain lion, and one looked disturbingly human. A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. He opened it to find Sheriff Hawkins standing there, his expression grim. "Mr. Thompson," the sheriff said, his voice gruff. "We need you to come down to the station. Some new evidence has come to light." Mark's heart raced. "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That's what we're going to find out. Now, are you coming willingly, or do I need to make this official?" Knowing he had no choice, Mark nodded and followed the sheriff to his cruiser. The ride to the station was tense and silent, broken only by the crackle of the police radio. At the station, Mark was led to the same interrogation room as before. This time, however, there was a large manila envelope on the table. Sheriff Hawkins sat across from him, joined by Detective Chen. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Chen began, her voice carefully neutral, "we've received some concerning information from a hiker who was in the area on the night Ms. Winters disappeared." She opened the envelope and pulled out a series of grainy photographs. Mark leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. The images were dark and blurry, clearly taken at night, but he could make out two figures in a clearing. One appeared to be on the ground, while the other loomed over it. The hiker claims he heard screams and went to investigate. Sheriff Hawkins explained. "He took these photos from a distance before fleeing the scene. Says he was too scared to come forward until now." Mark stared at the photos, his mind racing. This could be evidence of the attack, of the creature. Detective Chen's voice was cold. "Mr. Thompson, we've had these images analyzed by forensic experts. While the quality is poor, they're consistent with two human figures. One appears to be assaulting the other." The implication hung heavy in the air. Mark felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what they were suggesting. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No. You've got it all wrong. That's not me in those pictures. It's the creature. It's proof that I'm telling the truth." Sheriff Hawkins leaned forward, his eyes boring into Mark. "Son, I think it's time you told us what really happened out there. No more stories about monsters, just the truth." Mark's mind raced. How could he make them understand? How could he convince them of what he'd seen when all the evidence seemed to point in the other direction? "I swear to you," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I didn't hurt Rachel. We were attacked. These photos, they must be of the attack. It's proof that something was out there." Detective Chen sighed, exchanging a glance with the sheriff. "Mark, we've had wilderness experts examine these photos. They all agree. There's nothing in these images that suggests any kind of animal attack. What we see here is consistent with a human-on-human assault." Mark felt the walls closing in around him. His one piece of potential evidence, the one thing that might have proven his story, was being used against him. He buried his face in his hands, trying to fight back the wave of despair threatening to overwhelm him. "I didn't do it," he mumbled, more to himself than to the officers. "I couldn't have. I loved her." Sheriff Hawkins's voice softened slightly. "Mark, sometimes people do things they never thought they were capable of, especially when drugs are involved. If something happened out there, if you got scared or angry or confused, it's better to come clean now." The incessant beeping of my alarm clock pierced through the veil of sleep, dragging me back to consciousness. My eyes snapped open, and for a brief, blissful moment I forgot everything. Then, like a tidal wave, the memories came crashing back. Rachel's face contorted in terror, the inhuman roar that still echoed in my nightmares, the feeling of utter helplessness as I watched her disappear into the darkness. I sat up, my shirt drenched in cold sweat. It had been 3 months since that fateful camping trip. but the horror of that night refused to loosen its grip on my psyche. Sleep had become a luxury I could rarely afford, and when I did manage to drift off, my dreams were plagued by visions of that thing. BigFoot, Sasquatch, the elusive creature of myth and legend. Except it wasn't a myth anymore, not to me, not after what I'd seen. I dragged myself out of bed and shuffled to the bathroom, wincing at my reflection in the mirror. Dark circles hung under my bloodshot eyes, and my once neatly trimmed beard had grown into a wild, unkempt mess. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to wash away the remnants of my latest nightmare. As I made my way to the kitchen, I nearly tripped over a stack of books piled haphazardly on the floor. The Sasquatch Encounters, Bigfoot Fact or Fiction, In Search of the North American Ape, titles that had become my constant companions over the past few months. I'd devoured every piece of literature I could find on the subject, desperate for some shred of evidence that could validate my experience. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the air with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I poured myself a cup, black and strong, and settled down at my cluttered desk. My laptop hummed softly as I opened it, revealing dozens of open tabs, forums, blogs, and news articles all dedicated to Bigfoot sightings and theories. As I scrolled through the latest posts, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my sister, Sarah. "Hey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" I stared at the message, guilt gnawing at my insides. I'd been pushing everyone away, so consumed by my obsession that I'd neglected the people who cared about me. With a sigh, I typed out a response. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just been busy. Sorry for being MIA." It was a lie, of course. I was far from fine, but how could I explain what I was going through? How could I make them understand the weight of what I'd witnessed? My phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Mike, one of the friends who'd been with us on that ill-fated camping trip. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" "Hey, man." Mike's voice came through, a mixture of concern and frustration evident in his tone. "Look, I know you're going through something, but you can't keep shutting us out like this." I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling a headache coming on. "I'm not shutting anyone out, Mike. I've just been processing things." "Processing?" Mike scoffed. "Is that what you call becoming a hermit and obsessing over Bigfoot conspiracy theories?" "They're not conspiracy theories," I snapped, my temper flaring. "You were there, Mike. You saw what happened to Rachel." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mike spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with sadness. "I know what we saw that night was unexplainable. But man, you can't let it consume you like this. Rachel wouldn't have wanted that." The mention of her name sent a fresh wave of pain through my chest. "You don't know what she would have wanted," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's gone, Mike, and whatever took her is still out there." "Listen," Mike said, his tone pleading. "We're all worried about you. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight? Sarah and Tom will be there too. It'll be good for you to get out of the house, be around people." I closed my eyes, feeling torn. Part of me longed for the normalcy of a simple dinner with friends, but the thought of facing their pitying looks and well-meaning but misguided attempts to help me move on made my stomach churn. I can't, Mike. Not tonight. I've got some research to do." Mike sighed heavily. "Research? Right. Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. Just take care of yourself, okay?" "Yeah, I will. Thanks, Mike." I ended the call and tossed my phone aside, feeling a mixture of guilt and relief. I knew my friends were worried, but they couldn't understand. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. They hadn't felt the primal fear that coursed through my veins every time I closed my eyes. Turning back to my laptop, I dove back into my research. Hours passed as I pored over eyewitness accounts, blurry photographs, and supposed footprint casts. Some of the stories were clearly hoaxes or the product of overactive imaginations, but others rang with a chilling authenticity that sent shivers down my spine. As the sun began to set, Casting long shadows across my cluttered living room, I came across a forum post that made my heart race. It was from a hiker who claimed to have spotted a large hair-covered figure in the same mountain range where we'd been camping. The post was only a few days old. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. I needed to see for myself. I needed proof. The drive to the mountains was a blur of winding roads and fading daylight. By the time I reached the trailhead, night had fallen, and a thick blanket of clouds obscured the moon and stars. I sat in my car, heart pounding, as I stared into the inky blackness of the forest. What am I doing? I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. But I knew the answer. I was chasing answers, chasing validation, chasing the slim hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find some clue about what happened to Rachel. With shaking hands, I grabbed my backpack, stuffed with a flashlight, some water, and my camera. As I stepped out of the car, the cool mountain air hit me like a slap to the face, bringing with it the earthy scent of pine and decaying leaves. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The forest loomed before me, silent and foreboding. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig under my feet, sent my heart racing. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that I needed to stay calm, to stay alert. As I ventured deeper into the woods, following the same trail we'd taken that fateful night, memories flooded back. Rachel's laugh as she teased Mike about his fear of spiders. The warmth of the campfire as we toasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories. The peaceful serenity of the wilderness that had so quickly turned into a nightmare. I don't know how long I wandered through the darkness, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the forest floor, searching for... what? Footprints? Broken branches? Some sign that the creature had been here? Then, in the distance, I heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath my feet. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It couldn't be. Not again. Slowly I turned, my flashlight beam trembling as I swept it across the tree line. And there, just for a moment, I saw it. A massive hair-covered figure easily 8 feet tall, its eyes reflecting the light like two glowing embers in the darkness. A scream caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the underbrush. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. Panic seized me, and I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys before practically throwing myself inside. As I sped down the mountain road, my mind raced. I had seen it. It was real. But what did it mean? Was it the same creature that had taken Rachel? And if it was, why hadn't it come for me? By the time I made it back to my apartment, the first rays of dawn were beginning to peek over the horizon. I stumbled inside, exhausted and shaken to my core. As I collapsed onto my couch, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "Missed you at dinner last night. Please call me when you can. We're all worried about you." I stared at the message, feeling a wave of guilt wash over me. I had pushed everyone away, so consumed by my need for answers that I'd forgotten about the people who cared about me. But how could I go back to a normal life now? How could I pretend that everything was okay when I knew what was out there? With trembling fingers, I dialed Sarah's number. She picked up on the second ring. "Hello? Are you okay?" The concern in her voice was palpable. I don't know, Sarah," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I saw it again. Last night. In the mountains." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "Listen to me. You need help. This obsession, it's not healthy. Please, let us help you." I wanted to argue, to make her understand that what I'd seen was real, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself breaking down, months of pent-up fear and grief pouring out in heaving sobs. "I miss her so much, Sarah. I choked out. I couldn't save her. I couldn't do anything. I know, Sarah soothed, her own voice thick with emotion. We all miss her. But Rachel wouldn't want you to destroy yourself like this. Come stay with us for a while. Please. As much as I wanted to resist, to continue my solitary quest for answers, I found myself agreeing. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I did need help. But deep down, I knew that no matter what happened, I could never forget what I'd seen. The truth was out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, and someday, somehow, I would find it. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and conflicting emotions. I packed a bag and moved in with Sarah and her husband, Tom. Their spare room became my sanctuary, a place where I could retreat when the weight of everything became too much to bear. Sarah, bless her heart, did her best to make me feel at home. She cooked my favorite meals, engaged me in conversations about anything and everything except that night in the mountains, and even convinced me to join her for a few sessions with a therapist she knew. Dr. Amelia Chen was a kind-faced woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to look right through you. During our first session, I sat stiffly on her plush couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Why don't you tell me why you're here?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice gentle and non-judgmental. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I saw something that shouldn't exist, and now I can't stop thinking about it. About her. Dr. Chen nodded, encouraging me to continue. And so, haltingly at first, then with increasing urgency, I poured out the whole story. The camping trip, the terrifying encounter in the woods, Rachel's disappearance, and my obsessive search for answers in the months that followed. When I finished, Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment, her pen poised over her notepad. Finally, she spoke. "That must have been a traumatic experience for you. It's natural to seek answers after something so inexplicable happens." I leaned forward, hope blooming in my chest. "So you believe me? About what I saw?" Dr. Chen's expression softened. "What I believe isn't important. What matters is how this experience has affected you and how we can help you process it in a healthy way." I slumped back in my seat, disappointment washing over me. Of course she didn't believe me. No one did. "I know what I saw," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "I'm not here to dispute your experience," Dr. Chen said gently. "But I am concerned about how this search for answers is impacting your life. You've isolated yourself from friends and family, neglected your work, your health. Is that what Rachel would have wanted for you?" The mention of Rachel's name sent a jolt through me. "You don't know what she would have wanted," I snapped, echoing the words I'd said to Mike. "She's gone. Because of that thing." Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "I understand you're in pain. Grief can manifest in many ways, and sometimes, when a loss is sudden and unexplained, we cling to explanations, even extraordinary ones, to make sense of it." I stood up abruptly, anger and frustration boiling over. "This isn't about grief. This is about the truth. Something took Rachel, something that shouldn't exist, and it's still out there." Dr. Chen remained calm in the face of my outburst. "I hear your frustration. But consider this. Even if what you believe is true, is this obsession helping you? Is it bringing you closer to the answers you seek, or is it pushing away the people who care about you?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I sank back down onto the couch, suddenly feeling drained. I don't know how to let it go," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to let it go entirely," Dr. Chen said softly. "But perhaps we can work on finding a balance, a way to honor Rachel's memory and process your experience without it consuming your entire life." As much as I wanted to argue, to insist that she didn't understand, a small part of me recognized the truth in her words. I nodded slowly, feeling a mix of resignation and relief. The next few weeks were a struggle. I attended regular sessions with Dr. Chen, trying to work through my trauma and grief. Sarah and Tom did their best to keep me engaged, inviting me to movie nights and game nights with friends. Slowly, hesitantly, I began to reconnect with the world I'd pushed away. But the nightmares persisted. Night after night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of Rachel's scream ringing in my ears. And during the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying her somehow by trying to move on. One evening, about a month after I'd moved in with Sarah and Tom, I found myself sitting on their back porch, staring up at the star-filled sky. The night was cool and clear, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Sarah joined me, wordlessly handing me a steaming mug of tea before settling into the chair beside me. For a while, we sat in companionable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke. "You know, I miss her too." I turned to look at her, surprised by the raw emotion in her voice. Sarah had always been the strong one, the one holding everyone else together. "I keep expecting her to call," Sarah continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. "To hear her laugh, to listen to her rant about her latest creative project. It doesn't feel real that she's just gone." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I've been so caught up in my own grief, my own obsession, that I forgot. I forgot that I'm not the only one hurting." Sarah reached out and squeezed my hand. "We all process grief differently, but we shouldn't have to do it alone." As I looked at my sister, I felt something shift inside me. The wall I'd built around myself, the barrier that had kept everyone at arm's length, began to crumble. "I saw it again," I blurted out, the words tumbling from me before I could stop them. That night I went back to the mountains. I saw the creature. I expected Sarah to pull away, to look at me with the same mixture of pity and concern I'd seen in everyone else's eyes. Instead, she simply nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. "Tell me about it," she said softly. And so I did. I told her everything. The forum post that had led me back to the mountains, the terrifying encounter in the darkness, the overwhelming mix of fear and vindication I'd felt. The tires of my old Subaru crunched over the gravel as I pulled away from the trailhead, leaving behind a small bouquet of wildflowers. 10 years to the day since Rachel vanished, and the weight of her absence still pressed down on my chest like a stone. The familiar ache settled in as I navigated the winding road that would take me out of the Santa Cruz Mountains for what I promised myself would be the last time. As the dense canopy of redwoods began to thin, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. My heart nearly stopped. Two glowing eyes, like embers in the growing darkness, stared back at me from the shadows of the tree line. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing slightly on the loose gravel. When I looked again, the eyes were gone. "Get it together, Alex," I muttered to myself, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's just your imagination." Again. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. The same primal fear that had gripped me a decade ago came rushing back, and suddenly I was 25 again, lost in these godforsaken woods with Rachel by my side. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's over," I said aloud, my voice sounding hollow in the emptiness of the car. "You're leaving. It's done." As if in response, a low, guttural growl emanated from the surrounding forest. I didn't wait to see if my mind was playing tricks on me again. I floored the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever lurked in those trees as possible. The mountains receded in my rearview mirror as I sped towards the highway, but the nagging feeling that this wasn't over, that it would never truly be over, clung to me like a shroud. 3 days later, I was back in my apartment in San Francisco, trying to shake off the lingering unease from my trip to the mountains. I'd barely slept since that night, plagued by nightmares of glowing eyes and twisted reaching branches. Even in the bustling city, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. My phone buzzed, startling me out of my reverie. It was a text from my sister Megan. "Hey, you okay? Haven't heard from you since your trip. Call me." I sighed, knowing I couldn't avoid her forever. Megan had been my rock through everything that happened with Rachel, but lately, I'd been pulling away. It was easier than trying to explain the inexplicable dread that had taken up residence in my gut. I hit the call button, and she picked up on the second ring. Alex? Thank God. I was starting to worry. Hey, Meg. Sorry, I've been distracted. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Megan spoke again, her voice was gentle. The anniversary hit you hard this year, huh? I ran a hand through my hair, debating how much to tell her. Yeah, you could say that. I saw something up there, Meg, something that shouldn't be possible. What do you mean? The concern in her voice was palpable. I took a deep breath. Remember what I told you about that night? The eyes in the woods? The growling? Alex? Megan's voice took on a warning tone. We've been over this. The police found no evidence of any large predators in the area. You were traumatized, probably hallucinating from the mushrooms. I know what I saw, I snapped, immediately regretting my outburst. I'm sorry, I saw it again, Meg, when I was leaving the mountains. Those same eyes watching me from the trees. The silence on the other end of the line stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Megan spoke, her voice carefully measured. Alex, I think it might be time to consider talking to someone again. Dr. Reeves helped you a lot after everything. Maybe it would be good to schedule a few sessions? I felt a familiar wave of frustration wash over me. I'm not crazy, Megan. I know what I saw. I never said you were crazy, she replied softly. But you've been through a lot, and grief can manifest in strange ways. Please just think about it, okay? I mumbled a non-committal response and we said our goodbyes. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was utterly alone in this. No one believed me. Not the police, not my family, not even Rachel's parents. They all thought I was either lying or delusional. But I knew the truth. Something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. And now, 10 years later, it felt like it was calling me back. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. I'd made a promise to myself to leave it all behind, to finally move on with my life. But as I looked out my apartment window at the San Francisco skyline, I couldn't help but feel that the mountains were calling to me, their siren song impossible to ignore. That night, the dreams came again, more vivid than ever before. I found myself back in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filling my nostrils. But something was different this time. Instead of the paralyzing fear that usually accompanied these nightmares, I felt a strange sense of purpose. I was walking along a familiar trail, the one Rachel and I had taken on that fateful night. The forest around me was eerily silent, no bird song or rustling of small animals, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling out from deeper in the woods. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I'd recognize it anywhere. Rachel? I called out, my heart racing. Rachel, is that you? The voice came again, slightly louder this time. Alex, help me. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I plunged deeper into the forest. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, always just out of reach. Rachel, I shouted, desperation creeping into my voice. Where are you? The trees began to thin, and I found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive, gnarled oak tree, its branches reaching towards the sky like grasping fingers. And there, at the base of the tree, was Rachel. She looked exactly as she had 10 years ago, her long brown hair tangled with leaves and twigs, her green eyes wide with fear. But there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite place. Alex, she said, her voice hollow and distant. You came back for me. I took a step towards her, relief and confusion warring within me. Rachel, I don't understand. How are you here? What happened to you? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I never left, Alex. I've been here all along, waiting for you to find me." As she spoke, I noticed movement behind her. The shadows at the base of the oak tree seemed to be shifting, growing darker and more substantial. 2 pinpricks of light appeared in the darkness, and with a jolt of terror, I realized they were eyes. "Rachel, we need to go," I said urgently, reaching out to grab her hand. "It's not safe here." But as my fingers brushed against hers, I recoiled in horror. Her skin was ice cold and felt wrong somehow, as if it wasn't skin at all. Rachel's smile widened, revealing teeth that were suddenly too sharp, too numerous. "Oh, Alex," she said, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "Don't you see? I am the forest now, and you belong here with me." The shadows behind her surged forward, engulfing her form. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. As the darkness rushed towards me, I saw those glowing eyes one last time, filled with an ancient, terrible hunger. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat and tangled in my sheets. The dream had felt so real, so visceral, that for a moment I wasn't sure if I was truly awake. As my racing heart began to slow, I became aware of a dull pain in my hand. I switched on the bedside lamp and gasped. There, in the center of my palm, was a perfect impression of an oak leaf, the veins standing out angry and red against my skin. "What the hell?" I muttered, running my finger over the mark. It was hot to the touch, as if freshly branded. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face in an attempt to clear my head. When I looked up at the mirror, I nearly jumped out of my skin. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw Rachel standing behind me, her eyes glowing with that unearthly light. I whirled around, but the bathroom was empty. Just my imagination playing tricks on me again. Or was it? The mark on my palm throbbed, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. I'd tried for years to convince myself that what happened in those woods was just a tragic accident, that the things I saw were hallucinations brought on by grief and drugs. But now, with the evidence literally in the palm of my hand, I couldn't deny it any longer. Something was calling me back to the Santa Cruz Mountains. And this time, I knew I had to answer. The next morning, I called in sick to work and began packing a bag. I wasn't sure how long I'd be gone, but I knew I needed to be prepared for anything. As I threw clothes and supplies into my old hiking backpack, my phone buzzed incessantly. Texts and missed calls from Megan, all expressing increasing levels of concern. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. She deserved an explanation, but what could I possibly say? That I was going back to the place where my girlfriend disappeared because of a dream and a mysterious mark on my hand? She'd think I'd finally lost it completely. In the end, I settled for a text. "Need some time away to clear my head. Don't worry, I'll be in touch soon. Love you." It felt inadequate, but it was the best I could do. I couldn't drag Megan into this, not again. She'd been through enough because of me. As I zipped up my backpack, my eyes fell on the framed photo on my nightstand. It was Rachel and me, taken just a few weeks before that fateful camping trip. We were smiling, our whole lives ahead of us. I picked up the frame, running my thumb over Rachel's face. "I'm coming," I whispered. "I don't know what's waiting for me out there, but I'm coming." I placed the photo carefully in my bag and headed out, locking the apartment behind me. As I threw my gear into the trunk of my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might never see this place again. The drive to the Santa Cruz Mountains was surreal. I'd made this trip countless times over the years, always with a mix of dread and hope. But this time felt different. There was a sense of finality to it, as if I was hurtling towards some predetermined fate. As I neared the familiar turnoff for the state park, the mark on my palm began to throb more insistently. I glanced down at it, noting with alarm that the leaf pattern seemed to be spreading, tendrils of red creeping up my wrist. "What the hell is happening to me?" I muttered, flexing my hand on the steering wheel. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot at the trailhead, the same spot where I'd left flowers just days ago. As I stepped out of the car, The air seemed to shift, becoming heavier, more oppressive. The forest loomed before me, dark and forbidding. For a moment I hesitated. Was I really going to do this? Chase after ghosts and shadows based on nothing more than a dream and a strange mark? But then I thought of Rachel, lost somewhere in these woods for 10 long years. If there was even the slightest chance of finding out what really happened to her, I had to take it. I shouldered my pack and took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. As I stepped onto the trail, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. A cold wind whispered through the leaves, carrying what sounded like distant laughter. "I'm here," I said aloud, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the forest. "Whatever you are, whatever you want, I'm here." As if in response, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run back to the safety of my car. But I couldn't. Not now. I'd come too far to turn back. With one last look at the world I was leaving behind, I plunged deeper into the forest, the shadows swallowing me whole. The trail wound its way through the ancient redwoods, their massive trunks stretching up into the canopy far above. I'd hiked this path dozens of times over the years, searching for any clue as to what happened to Rachel. But this time felt different. The forest itself seemed alive, watching my every move with malevolent intent. As I walked, memories of that night 10 years ago came flooding back. Rachel and I had been so excited for our camping trip, a chance to get away from the stress of finals and just be together in nature. We'd taken mushrooms, wanting to experience the beauty of the forest in a new way. But something had gone terribly wrong. I remembered the way the trees had seemed to move, their branches reaching out to grab us, the eyes glowing in the darkness, always just out of sight. And then Rachel's scream, cut off abruptly as she was pulled into the shadows. I shook my head, trying to clear away the painful memories. I needed to focus on the present, on finding answers. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I came face to face with a massive oak tree. It stood alone among the redwoods, its gnarled branches twisting up towards the sky. With a jolt, I realized it was the same tree from my dream. The mark on my palm burned fiercely, and I found myself drawn towards the tree. As I approached, I noticed strange symbols carved into its bark, ancient-looking runes that seemed to shimmer and shift as I looked at them. "What are you?" I murmured, reaching out to trace one of the symbols with my finger. The moment my skin made contact with the bark, a jolt of energy surged through me. I stumbled back, gasping for air as strange visions flashed before my eyes. I saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, untouched by human hands. I saw native tribes performing rituals around this very tree, offering sacrifices to some unseen entity. And I saw something else, something ancient and terrible that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. As the visions faded, I found myself on my knees, my entire body shaking. The mark on my palm had spread further, the intricate pattern of veins now covering my entire forearm. "Alex?" I whirled around at the sound of my name, my heart leaping into my throat. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Rachel. She looked exactly as she had the night she disappeared, young, beautiful, and terrified. But there was something off about her, a sort of shimmer around the edges as if she wasn't quite solid. "Rachel?" I choked out, hardly daring to believe my eyes. "Is it really you?" She took a step towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Alex, you shouldn't have come back. It's not safe here." I scrambled to my feet, wanting nothing more than to run to her, to hold her in my arms after all these years. But something held me back, a growing sense of wrongness that I couldn't shake. "What happened to you, Rachel?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Where have you been all this time?" She smiled sadly, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something else behind her eyes, something ancient and hungry. "I never left, Alex. I've been here all along, waiting for you." As she spoke, the air around her seemed to ripple and distort. Her form flickered, and for a split second, I saw something else standing in her place. A twisted, inhuman shape with too many limbs and glowing eyes. I stumbled backward, my back pressed against the oak tree,